A billionaire heiress boards her private jet, only to find a tired nurse asleep in her seat. What begins as a mistake turns into a love story that proves fate never gets it wrong. Daniel Brooks was not a man of luxury. His life was measured in long shifts, hurried footsteps, and whispered reassurances at hospital bedsides. As a male nurse, his days rarely belonged to him. He spent them darting through crowded corridors, adjusting IV lines, comforting the elderly, and holding the hands of patients who had no one else. His paycheck was modest, his wardrobe simple, and his dreams quiet. Just enough stability to care for his younger sister and keep food on the table. What Daniel lacked in wealth, he made up for in compassion. Patients remembered his kindness, his way of listening without judgment, and his ability to smile even after 16 hours on his feet. But behind those smiles was exhaustion that clung to his body like a heavy coat. That morning, exhaustion had nearly won. After finishing a grueling night shift, his phone buzzed with a call that shook the fog from his mind. It was news about his sister in Paris. Her health had worsened suddenly, and she needed him. Panic laced his fatigue as he threw a few clothes into a worn duffel bag and rushed toward the airport. Every step felt heavier than the last. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, and his head ached from the night's chaos. At the bustling terminal, people rushed past him with polished shoes and neatly pressed suits, but Daniel barely noticed. His only thought was, get to Paris. Then in the chaos, a strange turn of fate occurred. As he wandered half aware, clutching his bag, he noticed a group of sharply dressed attendants walking briskly toward a private boarding gate. Without hesitation and too tired to think clearly, Daniel followed them. No one questioned him. No one stopped him. His scrubs, though wrinkled, seemed to blend in as if he belonged. Before he could process what was happening, he was ushered past velvet ropes, through a quiet corridor, and onto a sleek private jet. The air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. Daniel blinked, confused but too drained to argue. "This is smooth," he muttered almost to himself when a steward gestured him to a seat. No long lines, no impatient security, no shouting gate agents. Just silence, luxury, and efficiency. It felt unreal, but he told himself maybe this was a new service for emergencies. He dropped into one of the wide leather seats, and his body melted instantly. The chair cradled him like a soft cloud, far removed from the stiff hospital benches and narrow bus seats he was used to. For the first time in weeks, he let his muscles loosen, his eyelids grow heavy, and his mind drift. Before long, Daniel slipped into sleep, his head resting against the cool window. What he didn't know was that fate had played its hand. The jet he had boarded was not headed for a commercial flight to Paris. It wasn't even meant for people like him. This was the private plane of Sophia Loren, the billionaire heiress whose world could not have been further from his own. And as Daniel slept, unaware, the path of his life was quietly shifting towards something extraordinary. Sophia Loren was no stranger to extravagance. Born into privilege as the only daughter of a vast European business empire, she had lived her entire life under the relentless glow of chandeliers and camera flashes. Her calendar was filled with galas where crystal glasses clinked, charity dinners where her presence mattered more than her words, and interviews where journalists smiled but only ever asked about her father's empire. People bowed to her last name, not to her heart. Behind the glittering pearls, designer gowns, and inherited power, Sophia felt a quiet emptiness. She longed for someone to look at her and see Sophia, the woman, not the heiress. That morning seemed like any other. Her jet awaited at the private terminal, polished to perfection, with her assistants moving about briskly and her security detail ensuring every corner was secure. She stepped aboard expecting routine. Coffee served in delicate china, her seat prepared, her staff already settled. But the sight that greeted her was anything but routine. In one of the plush leather seats by the window sat a young man, fast asleep. His clothes were not silk or cashmere, but a pair of tired, wrinkled scrubs. A worn duffel bag rested by his side, its strap frayed from use. His head was tilted gently against the glass, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Sophia paused at the entrance, her perfectly arched brows drawing together. Who was this? An intruder? A mistake? For a moment, instinct demanded she call her guards. But before she could speak, the man shifted in his sleep. His head slipped softly onto her shoulder. Her body stiffened in surprise. No one touched her without permission. People usually treated her as porcelain, untouchable, or else as a golden ticket to power. Yet here he was, this stranger, leaning against her as if she were simply human. She didn't move him. Something in his face, the way exhaustion had softened his features, the almost childlike vulnerability, held her still. Minutes later, the stranger stirred awake. His eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding his gaze. He blinked at the polished cabin, the gilded details, and then at her. His posture snapped upright, horror dawning on his face. This, this isn't Air France, is it? He stammered, eyes darting wildly around the opulent space. Sophia couldn't help it. A soft laugh escaped her lips. The sound seemed to startle him even more. No, she said lightly, you're on my jet, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you're not my pilot either. Embarrassment flushed his cheeks as he scrambled to explain. His name was Daniel, he said, a nurse who had just finished a night shift. He spoke haltingly about his sister in Paris, about how urgent the call had been, and how, in his fog of exhaustion, he had simply followed the wrong group of attendants. Sophia listened, not politely as she did at business luncheons, but intently. There was no calculation in his voice, no rehearsed charm, no hidden request for favors. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't angling for a headline or a handout. He was just an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary mistake. And to her own surprise, that felt refreshing. For the first time in years, someone had entered her world by accident, and it made her feel seen in a way all the glitter never had. When the jet touched down in Paris hours later, Daniel felt both grateful and uneasy. The sheer absurdity of the situation gnawed at him. He had boarded the wrong aircraft, shared a flight with one of Europe's wealthiest women, and now stood at the edge of a life that felt far from his own. Slinging his worn duffel bag over his shoulder, he cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said quickly, avoiding her gaze, "but I'll manage from here. You've already done too much." Sophia, however, was not a woman easily dismissed. Her eyes, sharp yet kind, studied him for a moment. Then her voice cut through his protest with quiet resolve. "Let me help," she said firmly. "You cared enough to rush across the world for your sister. At least let me drive you there." Daniel opened his mouth to refuse, but something in her tone, steady, almost pleading, made him pause. He realized she wasn't offering from pity, but from a genuine desire to be part of his journey. Reluctantly, he nodded. The drive across Paris was unlike any ride Sophia had taken before. No security convoy, no tinted limousines, no polished assistants whispering schedules. Just her behind the wheel of a modest car, with Daniel beside her, directing through winding streets toward a quiet neighborhood far removed from the luxury she knew. When they arrived at the small apartment, Sophia felt her breath catch. The place was humble, its walls lined with faded photographs and secondhand furniture, but it pulsed with warmth. She followed Daniel into a dimly lit bedroom where his sister lay, pale but smiling weakly at the sight of him. Sophia stood back, silently observing. Daniel dropped to his knees beside the bed, his rough hands cradling his sister's fragile fingers. He spoke softly, his voice trembling with both relief and love. There was no performance here, no grandeur, just raw humanity. It wasn't glamour, but it was real. Something stirred in Sophia's chest, something she hadn't felt in years. She, who had been surrounded by excess all her life, was suddenly witnessing a richness that money could never buy. Days turned into weeks almost unnoticed. Sophia found herself returning, each time with a different excuse. Medicine tucked under her arm, groceries in her hands, or recipes she insisted they try together in the small kitchen. She learned to chop vegetables while Daniel's sister teased her gently, and she laughed more in those evenings than she had in entire seasons of glittering banquets. The walls between billionaire and nurse slowly dissolved. Sophia was captivated by Daniel's humility, his quiet strength, and the way he looked at her not as an heiress, but as a woman. Daniel, in turn, was disarmed by her willingness to leave behind her gilded cage, to sit on worn couches, to wash dishes in a cracked sink, to belong in a life so different from her own. By the time Sophia's jet was scheduled to take her back, she hesitated. Standing at the threshold, watching Daniel fuss over his sister's blanket, She realized she had found what her fortune could never buy: authenticity, kindness, and love. Daniel, too, faced a choice. He could retreat into his modest life, grateful for the strange detour, or take a leap of faith with the woman who had entered it by chance. And so, what began as a mistaken boarding became the opening chapter of an extraordinary journey, proof that sometimes fate doesn't make mistakes at all. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this every day. Stay tuned.